Alright, hi everyone. So today we're going to be talking about congressional term limits. So every 2 years we hold elections in the United States, and every 2 years we hear the same shallow promises from candidates on both sides of the aisle to clean up Washington and get Washington back to work. And to satisfy these promises, many politicians also tend to add a promise to support congressional term limits when they get into office. This is a particularly smart move, as nearly 75% of voters in 2016 polled in favor of congressional term limits, according to Rasmussen reports. But what the voters don't realize is that politicians who talk this talk often fail to walk the walk. And Representative Mike Gallagher of Washington, a Republican, discusses this in a 2017 op-ed for The Hill. As polarity becomes greater in politics, so does gridlock among long-term serving representatives and senators. And we face a major problem in the current divisiveness of our legislative branch, and will only continue to become more so if we allow for opponents of term limits to prevail. So, it is ultimately up to the voters to decide at the polls whether or not they want representatives that represent reform or status quo. But before we can discuss the issue of passing congressional term limits, we must first discuss the reason that we need them. So our legislative politics are more divided than ever. According to the Senate Historical Office, since 2011, Vice President Mike Pence has had to cast 11 votes to break ties in the U.S. Senate, which is more than any other vice president in the past century. And this includes votes on issues such as reforming healthcare and the nomination of judges and cabinet-level officials. In fact, Vice President Pence's vote on Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education was the first instance of a cabinet-level appointment to be decided by tiebreak in U.S. history. And the division is largely perpetuated by the Senate leadership on both sides of the aisle, which includes leaders such as Democrat Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and Republican Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who have held each of their Senate seats for more than 2 decades, despite rising levels of congressional unpopularity. Under Schumer and McConnell, 69.1% of Americans currently disapprove of Congress, according to Real Clear Politics. But due to their positions and their authority, they often face little or very substantial opposition. So with all this in mind, you may be wondering, if voters don't approve of the current gridlock in our legislature and its leadership, why has nothing happened to remedy it? Well, it's because the argument against term limits has consistently prevailed, despite obvious flaws in its reasoning, as shown by policy analyst Dan Greenberg in a report for the Heritage Foundation. Many claim that term limits would be undemocratic and they would limit voters' choices at the polls. But it has been proven that senators seeking re-election often have a much greater advantage than those that would seek to unseat them. For example, in 1992, challengers to incumbent senators raised, on average, 47 cents to every dollar that their opponents raised, and this is largely due to donations from major establishment and super PACs. So in fact, a lack of term limits infringes upon our democracy much more than a lack thereof. Another claim is that an already high congressional turnover rate would have already produced term limit legislation if it were necessary. This is problematic, as many senators are subject to intense pressure from interim leadership and are rarely successful in efforts against it. Also, they risk losing re-election bids and committee appointments if they show any opposition to their leaders. So as long as legislative leadership is against term limits, we will likely not see much to change the current status quo. It's all a game of money and power, and unfortunately, neither seem to be on the side of instituting term limits. It's obvious that Congress needs reform, so how do we accomplish it? Well, we must instate a 12-year term limit for members of the House and Senate, which would mean a cap of 2 terms for senators and 6 terms for representatives. And in doing so, we will make Congress look more like America and less like the Democratic and Republican parties. For example, according to the Heritage Foundation's policy experts, when George J. Mitchell, who's pictured here, of Maine, retired in 1995 after 2 complete terms in 3 years, his seat was contended by a variety of local government officials from all levels of Maine's local government. More elections like this will forge democratic processes with much more diverse options and competition and less of the status quo. The ultimate solution lies in the hands of the voters, to elect officials that support term limits and to hold those officials to their word in Congress and vote them out if they don't provide results. And the good news is that the power of the vote has already begun to prevail in the legislature. Representative Mike Gallagher, who we previously discussed, has joined forces with representatives across the aisle to instate term limits for the 115th Congress Congress and beyond. And what's even better is that President Trump has been vocal about his support for the group and its effort. But according to the Hill, we would have to amend the Constitution to make term limits a reality, which would require a 2/3 support in the federal legislature and 3/4 support among the states, which is an action that is both rare and difficult. So, though there is hope, it will take an engaged, determined voter population for us to reform Congress and make it work for America again. Thank you.